안녕하세요. 오늘 음악 인문학으로의 초대 시간에 오신 여러분 환영합니다. 저는 오늘 대담 진행을 맡게 된 강신우라고 합니다. 오늘 공연에 앞서서 잠시 이안 보스트리지에 대해서 간략하게 소개를 드리려고 잠시 나왔는데요. 물론 이안은 정말 세계적인 명성의 테너고 또 특히 오페라 리더싱으로서는 사실 소개가 필요 없는 독보적인 존재이죠. 근데 이안이 또 유명한 것은 여러분 잘 아시겠습니다만 노래하는 역사학자, 노래하는 인문학자로서의 면모죠. 오늘 시간도 그런 인문학적인 성찰을 나누는 시간이 될 텐데요. 원래 이안은 영국의 캠브리지 대학교에서 철학 석사를 하고 옥스퍼드로 가서 역사학 박사를 한 뒤에 옥스퍼드에서 역사를 가르치고 또 연구하던 아주 촉망받는 역사학자였습니다. 그런데 운명이 바뀐 건 당시에 정말 세계적인 바리톤이었던 디트리 피셔 디스카우를 취재하면서였다고 합니다. 피셔 디스카우가 2차 대전 때 독일군으로 참전을 했다가 전쟁 포로가 됐던 경험이 있었는데 그때 그 수용소에서의 경험을 역사학자로서 이안이 취재하는 그런 시간이었다고 해요. 그런데 인터뷰를 하고 있는데 피셔 디스카우가 보기에 이 젊은 학자 이안의 목소리가 너무 매력적이었던 겁니다. 그래서 자네 음악 한번 해보지 않겠나 이렇게 제안을 했나 봐요. 그래서 그런 것들을 계기로 해서 이안이 남들보다 사실 한참 늦은 20대 중반에 비로소 성악에 본격적으로 입문을 하게 됐고 수년 후인 29살에 런던 위그모홀에서 화려하게 데뷔를 하면서 오늘날 이런 유명한 테너의 반열에 올라서게 됐습니다. 그렇지만 학자로서의 분명히 시간이 있었기 때문에 지금도 사실은 굉장히 활발하게 책도 쓰고 또 강연 활동도 하는데 그동안 유독 우리나라에서는 어떤 역사학자로서의 이안을 만날 기회가 거의 없어서 좀 아쉬움이 많았습니다. 그래서 오늘 사실은 이 자리가 굉장히 특별한 시간이고 또 저도 그래서 굉장히 기대가 되는데요. 오늘 저녁에 이안이 고른 주제는 벤자민 브리튼의 음악과 전쟁입니다. 좀 무거운 주제일 수 있지만 또 여러분 잘 아시는 대로 지금 어떤 세계적인 상황과도 맞물려서 아주 시의적절한 주제라고 생각을 하는데요. 관련된 영상이 먼저 하나 준비되어 있습니다. 1차 대전 종식 100주년을 기념을 해서 이안과 피아니스트 안토니아 파파노가 함께 녹음했던 앨범 Requiem 중에서 Weil의 작품 Beat Beat Drums 연주 영상인데요. 먼저 영상 함께 보시고 이어서 오늘은 테너가 아닌 역사학자, 인문학자로서 이안 보스트리지의 강연 이어서 드리겠습니다. 먼저 영상 함께 보시겠습니다.
Burst like a ruthless force into the solemn church and scatter the congregation into the school where the scholar is studying. Leave not the bridegroom quiet, no happiness must he have now with his bride, nor the peaceful farmer any peace plowing his field or gathering his grain. So fierce you were and pound you drums, so shrill you bugles blow. Beat, beat drums, blow bugles blow over the traffic of cities, over the rumble of wheels in the streets, of beds prepared for sleepers at night in the houses. Those sleepers must sleep in those beds. No bargainers bargains by day, no brokers or speculators would they continue. Would the talkers be talking? Would the singer attempt to sing? Would the lawyer rise in the court to state his case before the judge? Then rattled quicker, heavier drums, you bugles wilder blow. Beat, beat, drums, blow, bugles blow. Make no parley, start expostulation. Mind not the timid, mind not the weeper or prayer, mind not the old man beseeching the young man. Let not the child's voice be heard, nor the mother's entreaties make even the trestles to shake the dead when they lie awaiting the hearses. So strong you thump, oh terrible drums, so loud you builders blow. Beat, beat drums, beat, beat drums, blow, builders blow. So, what you just heard was a song by Kurt Weil, the German refugee from Nazism who fled to the United States in the 1940s. It's a setting of a poem by Walt Whitman, which Whitman himself wrote during the American Civil War, some 80 years before. And here we have Kurt Weil trying to make himself part of America by attaching himself to this song of war, of probably the very first mechanized war in history. The first war with universally guns with rifling, with Gatling guns, with machine guns. So quite a significant moment in the history of warfare. It's an enormous pleasure and an honor for me to return to Korea, a country I've been visiting now for 20 years or so, singing all sorts of repertoire, from the Baroque to the Romantic, with orchestra and with piano. On this occasion, I'm going to be singing with the Se종solloi스츠, a very wonderful orchestra. I'm going to be singing a very great song cycle, Les Illuminations, by a very great composer, Benjamin Britten, a composer very close to my heart for a number of reasons. Britten's music was part of my growing up in the 1970s in the UK. He wrote a lot of his greatest music for us children, but because it was for children, didn't mean that he didn't pour his best efforts into it. When his friend, the musicologist Hans Keller, urged him to write more music in the mainstream classical genres or forms, those of symphony, piano concerto, or sonata, he replied that that was just not his way. He put a lot of his energy into opera, but even there, he mostly worked at what we might call the margins. Chamber operas for chamber orchestras, like The Turn of the Screw or The Rape of Lucretia. Marginal subjects, like his adaptation of Thomas Mann's novella Death in Venice, or even more radical innovations like the parable for church performance, Curlew River, based on a Japanese no play. He poured a lot of his greatest music into pieces in which children sang. Ceremony of Carols for Boys and Harp, the amateur opera, Neues Flood, the vaudeville, which he wrote for the Vienna Boys Choir, The Golden Vanity. These are all pieces I sang in as a boy, and so Britten is sort of written into my musical being. Another reason for Britten's importance to me as a singer is the license he gave me as a British singer, a singer from what the Germans used to call Das Land ohne Musik, the land without music, to sing confidently and, as it were, authentically, on a world stage. Above all, to perform the leader of Schubert, Schumann, and Wolf, as Britten and his partner, the tenor Peter Pears, did, to revelatory effect. Not only did Benjamin Britten raise the standards and sights of British music making as a performer, he also gave us a wealth of music almost unparalleled in our history. You'd have to go back to Handel, a born German but an adopted Englishman, to find the like of it. For me personally, this has meant an extraordinary body of song. It's arguable that Britten is the greatest song composer in the generation after Mahler and Richard Strauss. And we also have some amazing choral works. But above all, perhaps, for me and for many other people, it has meant his War Requiem of 1962, which I've now performed in public about 96 times. We all exist in the shadow of war. Throughout human history, it's perhaps peace that needs explaining rather than war. On a personal level, we live with the unexpected, random consequences of war. In my case, if my mother's first husband had not been killed on the Western Front in 1916, I wouldn't be here today. The broader political effects of past wars are all around us in the news every day. The Israeli-Palestinian impasse today is a distillation of wartime decisions made in 1917, 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, among others. The peoples of Korea, who suffered in a truly devastating war, often forgotten in the West, know this better than anyone, and we see all over the world the ways in which history can be difficult to evade or to understand. The understanding of historical complexity in the genesis and stubborn persistence of conflict can seem at one and the same time a heartless evasion, yet an absolute moral necessity. Britain's life and music were forged in the aftermath of wars, the two world wars, which have haunted societies, East and West, ever since. Born in November 1913, his maternal uncle was killed on the Somme in 1916, and one of his earliest memories was of a shell exploding opposite his house on the seafront at Lowestoft in the days around the Battle of Jutland, the only major naval engagement of the First World War. Between the wars, he developed as a pacifist, writing a school essay against war, much to the disgust of his teachers, refusing to join the school's officer training corps, distributing League of Nations pamphlets which advocated disarmament, the banning of arms sales, and the use of sanctions. Returning to the UK from a brief period in the US in 1941, via a dangerous transatlantic passage, Britain registered as a conscientious objector. And I quote, "The whole of my life," he wrote to the panel that assessed his application, "the whole of my life has been devoted to acts of creation, and I cannot take place in acts of destruction." The pacifists of the 1930s, W.H. Auden's low, dishonest decade, as he called it in a poem, notably failed to halt the headlong march to war in Europe. War was, of course, arguably already raging in Asia by 1931, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which gives us really only less than a decade of some sort of peace for the combatant nations at large, since the Russian Civil War ended only in 1923. So that's the end of the Russian Civil War, 1923, Japanese invasion of Manchuria, 1931. Britain's position in the 1930s, as part of a circle of progressive intellectuals opposed to the advance of fascism, was understandably not entirely clear. It was ultimately, for Britain,
only confrontation with the realities of wartime conscription that clarified his pacifist stance. Britten's music, however, whatever his personal beliefs and public positions, is best seen as a complex, layered mixture of musical imperatives, personal idiosyncrasies, dramatic demands, and political engagements. Britten did indeed write works with which he intended to propagandize. In some, the element of propaganda seems to overwhelm the questions of aesthetic value. One might suggest this to be the case with the pacifist march to words by Ronald Duncan, who later became librettist of his opera, The Rape of Lucretia. One might also say the same about Advanced Democracy, to words by Randall Swinger. Both were products of the Popular Front period of the mid-1930s. The War Requiem, 1962, is a different matter. While clearly intended as an artistic statement of Britain's stance against war, the War Requiem is a thing of such complexity and ambiguity, and Britten was nothing if not the master of musical poetic ambiguity and musical drama, viz. Turn of the Screw, Billy Bard, Death in Venice, that it is better seen as an act of remembrance, a bearing of witness, rather than as primarily or uncomplicatedly an extended song of protest. Britten wrote a simple account of his intentions in composing the War Requiem to his sister Beth. I hope it'll make people think a bit. This just after the first performance in 1962, in the era of Cold War brinksmanship, just after the erection of the Berlin Wall, and just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. But later on in the 1960s, he offered to the painter Sidney Nolan a more thoughtful and mystery-weaving account of his purposes, one fully consonant with his self-identification as an artist-dreamer, all the way from Les Illuminations via the Serenade and the Nocturne to the opera he made of Midsummer Night's Dream. In his remarks to Sidney Nolan, he painted the War Requiem as an attempt to modify or to adjust the wrongs of the world or the pains of the world with some dream, with some aesthetic kind of object. In this aesthetic, rather than merely propagandistic sense, Britten's works from the 1930s on are suffused with war. In the same way that an oeuvre so preoccupied with childhood innocence seems an apt consequence of the Freudian Revolution, so a life led in the persistent shadow of violent conflict inflects and influences most of Britten's work. Take the piece he called his real Opus 1, the radical, dizzying, florid orchestral song cycle Our Hunting Fathers, in which man's relentless abuse of animals stands proxy for the political violence of the age. A few years later, Britten wrote his Sinfonia da Requiem, the circumstances of whose commission reflect the discomforts of that low, dishonest decade of which Auden spoke, not to mention the moral compromises to which a jobbing composer might be prey. Britten was commissioned to write the piece by a Japanese government-appointed committee seeking works to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the notional founding of the imperial dynasty in 1940. This was the Japanese regime which had been fighting in Manchuria since 1931 and which had been the aggressor in the Second Sino-Japanese War, on which Britain's friends Auden and Isherwood had reported in 1937. Britten accepted the commission, which was also undertaken by Richard Strauss and Jacques Ibert, among others, and he even planned to visit Tokyo in due course on the condition that there would be no jingo, as he put it. Much to the contrary, Britain set about writing a piece which was almost bound to offend the Japanese committee, headed by Fumimaro Konoye, the Japanese Prime Minister 1937 to 39 and 40 to 41, and a key figure in the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and the intensifyingly totalitarian tendency of Japanese politics over those years. Britain told the New York Sun in April 1940 that he was making it just as anti-war as possible. He dedicated it to his late parents, and he wrote the Sinfonia structured around the rituals of the Catholic Requiem Mass for the dead. Britain summed up the genesis of the work quite aptly a couple of years later in 1942, writing that the death of his parents, quotes, had an especially powerful effect on me and set me, in self-defense, analyzing my feelings in regard to suffering and death. To this personal tragedy were soon added the more general world tragedies of the Spanish and the present wars. It's nevertheless hardly surprising that the work was rejected for the centenary celebrations as being so very different from the anticipation of the committee, as they said. The Sinfonia da Requiem remains a singular and potent pre-echo of the much better known War Requiem. Despite the way that war hovers over so much of Britain's work, from Our Hunting Fathers and the Sinfonia Requiem to the late song cycle, Who Are These Children, which has one particularly potent setting of a William Souter poem about the death of children as a result of aerial bombardment. Britain's own experience of war was that of a conscientious objector, far removed from the horrors of modern warfare. Just once did he choose to confront those horrors, when he insisted on accompanying the great violinist Yehudi Menuhin to play for survivors, many of them survivors of Auschwitz and other death camps, in Belsen in 1945. It was, in many ways, Britain declared, perhaps sheepishly, a terrifying experience. In the wake of that horror, he wrote his most subjectively guilt and horror-laced piece, driven perhaps by the furies of his own conscience, the Holy Sonnets of John Donne, 9 settings for voice and piano. On this tour in Korea, I have been and will be singing a cycle for voice and orchestra, Les Illuminations, that would seem at first sight to be 1,000,000 miles from all this, in setting with superb, in both senses, originality, the words of the enfant terrible of French poetry, Arthur Rimbaud, Britain confronted with an almost ideal balance between subjectivity and objectivity, peerless technique and sensuous inventiveness, insistent rhythm and seductive melody. Both the intoxicating and repellent craziness of modern living and the discovery of his own sexuality, the homosexuality he shared with the young Rimbaud. 2 of the songs are dedicated to the lovers he was making a choice between. In the end, he plumped for the tenor Peter Pears and mated for life. But the very opening of Les Illuminations is a clue to the darker unease which bubbles beneath the bright, glittering surfaces of Les Illuminations. It's a fanfare, that most military of musical topics, with a struggle between 2 keys which ride on the uncertainty of a hazy tremolo. The last setting, Départ, the goodbye to all that, is a threnody, though, and one that throbs with aching premonitions. Largo mesto, it is marked, slow, mournful, and the last words set talk of l'affection et le bruit neuf, new noise, the noise of war, perhaps. And after the voice has finished, the throbbing continues in the strings, morendo, dying. And as the music ends, at the bottom of the score, we read Amityville, New York, October the 25th, 1939. Composing far away from Europe, in upstate New York, did Britain's thoughts turn to the horror across the ocean, consciously or unconsciously? For it was on October the 25th, 1939, that the German army handed over control of much of occupied Poland to the civil administration, which would go on to murder millions. Thank you.